So thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. It's another beautiful day in Nova Scotia for a Coach PD session, and I hope it's the same way across the country. And we thank all the coaches across Canada who have been joining us throughout these coach socialization series. Throughout the past 3 months, it's hard to believe it's been 3 months already, we've been offering sessions weekly with a variety of professionals on a variety of topics. So we're really excited to have with us today, we have Simon Taylor, who is a mental performance consultant, excuse me, but also grew up as a competitive golf athlete and is currently studying in Scotland, is currently finishing his PhD. So today, Simon will be talking to us about the fear of failure. And if you have any questions, just feel free to use the chat box, and then we'll open it up for Q&A at the end. And Simon, you can take it away from here.
Thank you very much. Yes, welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining. Those of you who are living in Nova Scotia, I myself have spent all day indoors preparing for this, and it's really sunny and warm outside, so I very much appreciate you taking the time to be indoors with me. Just before I get started, I just want to give you a brief background on myself, just so you learn a bit more about me. So, as mentioned, I'm a PhD student in the University of Stirling in Scotland, and I am looking at how coaches basically impact athlete fear of failure. I'm also a mental performance consultant and a member of the Canadian Sports Psychology Association. Prior to that, I completed my master's in Stirling in Scotland in sports psychology, and before that, I completed my undergraduate degree in the US with a golf scholarship in an NCAA Division I university. So, as it says here today, I want to speak a bit about coaches, how you can actually impact athletes' fear of failure. And there's 4 big points I want to focus on today. The first one being, why am I talking about fear of failure? So why is this topic relevant in general? What actually is fear of failure? This is a topic this is a buzzword that's mentioned a lot nowadays, or just in general. So what it is and what it isn't, why you coaches should care about it, and then lastly, what you can do to reduce fear of failure within athletes. So I realized when I was creating this that this is a jam-packed session that I'm trying to fit in here, and I thought about things I could take away to try and make it a bit easier or a bit more lighthearted. But I wanted to make sure that you all leave with having as much as an understanding of this topic as possible. So it's going to be jam-packed with information, but I'm going to have time at the end to answer any questions you have. So if there's anything you don't quite understand and want me to talk about again, not a problem, happy to do so. And also I'm happy to email these slides to anyone at the end if they want to reread them again. Okay, so let's get started. So first of all, why am I talking about fear of failure? Well, fear of failure, like I mentioned, it's a topic, it's a buzzword that we hear athletes talk about, we hear people on television talk about, we use it ourselves a lot, but I'm not sure everyone really understands what it means. It's a bit of like a buzzword, and so no one really understands it that much in my mind. So to give you a few examples of what people, when they talk about fear of failure, what they mean, here, an easy example, you've all probably heard of The Simpsons, and if so, you've heard of Bart Simpson. And there was an episode where a school psychologist comes in and then says, Bart Simpson keeps getting Fs because he has fear of failure. So there's one way that fear of failure is considered something negative. Another example is Patrick Harrington. That's this man here. He's a golfer, a PGA Tour winner. He's won multiple British Opens as well. And he talks about fear of failure in a sense that I was so afraid of not playing well and not making the cut, I over-practice. So in these both of these examples, we can see that they talk about fear of failure as something that's hindered them, and it's like negative, has a negative connotations with it. Now, I want to give you other examples as well. One, this was a newspaper article in the UK, and it mentions this motivating force ever present in sport is known in football as fear of failure, and it's the most cited driver of effort among player surveys. So in this sense, they talk about fear of failure as being a positive thing, something that drives effort amongst players. And then Brendan Rodgers, that's this man here, he used to be, for those of you who are soccer fans or football fans, as we call it in Europe, He used to be the former Liverpool manager, and he said that fear of failure is what drives him on. So again, here he speaks of it like more in a negative manner. So as you can see, some use in like a positive way, some use in a negative way. So the question then is it actually a good thing or is it actually a bad thing? Should it be encouraged? Should it be discouraged? My answer right now is stick around and you'll find out. Okay, so what actually is fear failure? Before we can look at what fear failure is as a whole, we need to look at failure by itself. Failure is subjective. Every person might have a different definition of it. So it's important that we understand individual definitions of failure in itself before we look at fear failure. So for some people, success can be winning and losing can be failure, but that's not the case for everyone. So as I mentioned there, it's really important to understand how the individual defines failure, because it's a lot more complex than people might consider at the time. And of course, this the definition of failure, the individual's definition of failure, is subject to change as well. So it's important to keep that in mind too. So I've created this lovely little pyramid kind of thing here, and I'll try and try and explain it to you in hopes that it makes a bit more sense to you. So one way we can look at the individual's definition of failure is to look at how they define achievement. So the reason I use the term achievement is that every individual will come to training or come to a match with some sort of achievement goal in mind. So in that sense, if they achieve that achievement goal, they can consider it successful performance. And if they don't achieve that achievement goal, then you can consider that failure, I suppose. So here, I'll try and break this down now so it makes a bit more sense to all of you. Generally speaking, we can define achievement in three ways. Task is the task at hand. So if we use the example, throwing darts, okay? So if we define achievement in terms of task, we're simply talking about, I want to, let's say, hit the dartboard. That's the task at hand, is hitting the dartboard. I achieve it, my goal, if I hit the dartboard. That's one way of looking at it. The next way is looking at achievement in the definition of achievement is in relation to self. So if I'm looking at myself, it's not, I want to hit the dartboard, but it's, I want to score X amount of points today when I'm playing darts. And then the other way to define achievement is in relation to the opponent. And so I want to outperform my opponent. That's another way we can define achievement. And then to make things more fun, we have approaching success and avoiding failure here. And what that means is that each of these three definitions we see down here, so task, self, and opponent, can be geared towards approaching success or avoiding failure. So what I mean with that, let's look at the opponent. So if I'm playing darts against an opponent, I could say my goal today is to beat my opponent, to outperform my opponent. In that sense, I'm approaching success. I'm taking steps necessary to achieve success. On the other hand, I can also say, well, actually, my goal today is to avoid performing worse than my opponent. This distinction between approaching success and avoiding failure is a really important distinction to make, because depending on how you define achievement, it can have an impact on your motivation and many other factors as well. But that's not the point of today. Just wanted to let you know that failure is a really complex topic that I could spend hours talking on in it and of itself. But for the sake of today, I just wanted you to see that these are typically ways we can define achievement, and there's other ways as well, but this is a big way to do so. Okay, so now that we have an understanding of what failure is, let's look at fear failure. The academic definition of it is that fear failure is a disposition to experience anxiety and apprehension in evaluative situations because the individual has learned that failure is associated with negative consequences. Okay, that's a bit of a mouthful, so I'm going to try and break that down just to make it a bit more straightforward for you. So basically what this means is that failure in and of itself is meaningless and causes no emotional response. It's only when we have learned to attach meaning to the consequences of failure that we thus start to fear it. Another thing that I want to mention here is the evaluative situations. So an evaluative situation is basically any situation where the individual can be evaluated for their performance. So if we look at examples of this, one example could be sport. It could be training in sport. It could be a tournament in sport. These are situations where we're typically being evaluated the whole time. It's not only in sport that this is happening, though. You can be subject to evaluation in your job. You can be subject to evaluation in school. I'm subject to evaluation right now with this presentation. So any situation where evaluation occurs, there's the potential that those who have fear failure will experience anxiety in those situations. Okay. Yeah, I hope I'm not going too fast right now. I think I'm trying to speak slowly, but again, if you have any questions, just like put them in the chat box, and then at the end, I'll be sure to answer them. So yes, one last thing I want to say about fear failure. So because it's a disposition, and it means that the individual who has fear failure will typically experience anxiety in every type of evaluative situation. So it won't just be sport, it'll likely also be in school, it'll be in their job, it'll be in situations where they're being evaluated, that they will have these feelings of anxiety. Okay, now that we've got the understanding of the definition, I want to talk a little bit about like how fear failure is established within individuals. So what happens is that fear failure, this disposition, is developed in the early stages of someone's life. So what happens is that your child, let's say you're learning to ride a bike without the things on the back, the wee wheels that help you stay not tip over. So you've got them on the back, and then you take them off, and then you try and cycle, and the child fails, so falls off the bike. And then as a response, the parent might then scold the child, might withhold affection from the child, might not pay them any attention from the child. And that in and of itself isn't necessarily problematic. The problem occurs is if the child then succeeds and then the parent says, well done, I'm so proud of you, the child learns over time, not just in a single event, the child will then learn, okay, if I do well, my parents will pay attention to me, they will reward me, they will encourage me, they will show me affection, and so on and so forth. However, when I fail in their eyes, they will maybe scold me, they will withhold affection and attention from me. So they recognize that that affection from parents is dependent on their success, okay? So if you tie these things together often enough, the child will eventually develop fear failure here. And as a result of having fear failure, the child will then try and avoid failing in general, but will also experience a lot of evaluative situations where they'll try and get out of being in these situations in general as well. So what that means is, as you develop fear failure, you try and get out of these situations that induce fear failure, and that just increases the likelihood of you failing again when you actually get into those situations. So what happens then is that you basically, it's a self-perpetuating cycle that you learn failure, you develop fear failure, and then it never ends. It keeps going. So I just got a bit distracted there because I think someone had their microphone on. Okay. Yeah, there we go. The microphone's off now, whoever you are. Thank you. Okay, the next thing that I wanted to talk about. So the child has developed fear failure now through their parents. And sorry, I should also mention that it's not just parents that can do this. Once the child has fear failure, the coach can then also be the one strengthening fear failure within the athletes as well, but I'll get to that in a bit. So once the child has developed fear failure, what happens then is they don't need the parents or anyone else to be around for it to get worse. So if a child fails, and let's say I'm out there, I'm a golfer, so let's say I'm out there and I fail, and then I treat myself in the same manner that coaches and parents treated me. And so that would be like self-critically and self-blaming, and then that will lead to me experiencing fear failure as well. And so in a sense, that leads to me wanting to avoid these situations as well. And then again, that creates this like never-ending cycle of me having fear failure. It's important to mention that it's not just, parents don't intentionally do this, okay? So like if a parent withholds attention from a child that has failed, it's not because they're necessarily trying to encourage fear failure. These are really subtle behaviors that parents can do and coaches can do that induce fear failure in children. And it can be verbal, it can be nonverbal. It's just when these happen over and over again, over time, over a set period of time, the child learns that affection is dependent on success, okay? So if you're a parent here and you're listening to this and thinking, oh, I might be responsible for inducing fear failure in my children, it's not necessarily something you've done wrong intentionally, okay? So I wanted to just point that out there to you. All right, so now that we understand fear failure a bit more, we understand the definition of it, how it's developed, I want to look at the concept of fear failure as a whole. So we talk about fear failure, and that's this here. That's the general term that fear failure is. However, fear failure can be, for better or for worse, subdivided into 5 different categories, okay? So these categories combined make up a general fear failure, but there's different types of fears that people experience. And based on research, the 5 that I mentioned down here, these are the 5 most common fears that individuals will experience. The main one is called fear, shame, and embarrassment. What that means is just that fear, shame, and embarrassment means that you're worried that you're not going to live up to a certain expectation you have set for yourself. You're not going to live up to this ideal you have of yourself. So in that case, you fear that shame will be followed by failure. And that is basically the main one that we experience. Other than that, the next one is called fear of devaluing one's self-estimate. That basically means that you're worried that if you fail, you're going to have to lower your own perception of your own ability. So if you think my skill level's up here, if you have fear failure, you go out and you might be like, well, if I don't play well, if I don't succeed, then I might have to actually be like, well, actually I'm not as good as I thought I was. So that's another fear that people might have. A common one would be fear of uncertain future. So if we imagine being on a team or being an athlete, you go out there, you play, and then you worry that, well, if I don't perform to a certain level, I might not get a scholarship, I might lose a scholarship, I might get kicked off the team, so on and so forth. And then the last 2 are in relation to others. So fear of upsetting important others and fear of letting important others down. Again, fear failure is developed through parental practices and but also coaches can influence as well, or school teachers, people that are important figures in our lives can have an impact on our fear failure. So if I worry about letting them down or letting important others down, because that can be another cause for me to experience fear failure, yeah. All right, so let's use some examples to just try and paint a picture of why you coaches should still be here listening to me. So I'm going to use subtle example here because there's obviously more explicit ones I can use, but I want to focus on more subtle ones to see how day-to-day coaching practices might have an impact on athletes' fear failure. So one is, if we imagine a coach is away with a team on an event at a tournament, and then the coach says, all right, team, today, this is the coach's pre-tournament speech. If you perform well today, if we succeed, if we win, I'm taking you to this fancy steak restaurant and you can eat everything you want, okay? That sounds great. However, the coach then says, if you fail, we're taking you to McDonald's and that's it. And you'll get a $5 budget and that's all you're getting, okay? So what we call this is controlling use of rewards. And basically, this means that the coach, by using controlling use of rewards, this can increase athletes' fear failure because it shows that the coach cares more about the athletes reaching a certain standard irrespective of effort involved, okay? So when we go back to the definition of failure, if let's say the coach says success is winning, failure is not winning, and we use this example then, let's say the whole team reached their goals, their achievement goals, and performed to us beyond their expectation, but they didn't win because the other teams were just better. And then the coach says, I don't care, you're not, we're going to McDonald's because you didn't win. Okay, so we can kind of see how a situation like this can be potentially harmful to athletes and induce fear failure or increase fear failure within your athletes. Okay. All right. Let's look at a different example. We've got a training session here, yeah? So I'm going to use golf as an example, which is quite easy for me just being a golfer myself. If we imagine a driving range and the coach is standing there with 5 athletes on the range and the coach says, all right, team, I want you all to do work on this technical aspect of your swing, whatever it is. That's irrelevant right now, okay? So there's 5 people hitting golf balls on the driving range doing their drills and 4 doing well. And then the coach walks by these players, observes them, the separate players, and then acknowledges their progress and is supportive and says, hey, good job. I like how you're doing this. Keep it up. And just has small talk with them. However, there's one poor sod that isn't doing very well, and the coach comes and observes them. And then when the coach sees that they're struggling, instead of being supportive and chatting with them and helping them, the coach just ignores this player and is just indifferent to the fact that this player's struggling a bit. Okay, so what we call this is negative conditional regard, because this can increase athletes' fear of failure because the coach unintentionally or intentionally shows the athlete that they have no interest to them unless they reach a certain milestone. So I've told you what to do. You're not doing as you're told. So I don't really have any interest in you until you do as you're told. Okay. And these are quite common day-to-day things. And I'm not saying that coaches are doing these things intentionally, but this can be very subtle behavior. It doesn't have to be you simply ignoring a player or talking to them. Just by the way your facial expression is, that can indicate disappointment in your athletes. So there's a lot of things that coaches can do to, let's say, induce fear or increase fear failure in athletes potentially without the coach even being aware of it, okay? The other thing I want to mention is that athletes who have fear failure have grown up in an affection-deprived home to an extent, and they are very susceptible to these types of behaviors. And because they're more primed to recognize these verbal and non-verbal cues that indicate disappointment. All right. So it's quite easy for an athlete to pick up on this, whereas you as a coach might not be aware of this. And the other thing I want to point out, that if you're a coach and you say, well, I've done this, that doesn't necessarily mean you're a bad coach. It doesn't mean you're a bad coach, full stop. All right. It also doesn't mean that you've necessarily increased fear failure within athletes. Like I mentioned, athletes with fear failure have learned over time, over X amount of years, that their affection from important others is dependent on their success. So if you as a coach once or twice, let's say, get disappointed with an athlete for not performing to a certain standard, that doesn't give them fear failure straight away. It's if that athlete has learned that you as a coach have over time constantly do this and ignore them when they don't reach your expectations and so on and so forth, that they then are susceptible to having increased levels of fear failure. Okay. And there's obviously other examples as well. Yeah. So I just used very subtle examples, but there's examples of where coaches intimidate athletes and say, look, if you don't play well, that's it, you're off the team, I'm kicking you off, you're losing your contract, that kind of stuff. That's a very obvious way where I think we can all agree that it's quite straightforward to imagine how a coach might impact athlete fear failure in that sense. Another example would be yelling at the player, just shouting them, saying you're bloody useless, something like that. So things like this, these are more explicit examples. But like I said, I just wanted to focus on subtle ones that might be more prominent. All right, so now we're getting to the more interesting part of the presentation for you, I think. So what does it mean to have fear failure? I've talked about why fear failure is, how it's developed and everything, but what does fear failure actually mean? Well, researchers, based on all the research that's been done, we have seen that fear failure is associated with variables such as stress, burnout, aggression, appeasement, dropping out of sport, having poor, lower quality motivation, experiencing anxiety, and self-handicapping, okay? So these are all undesirable variables, okay? So if we look at the example with Padraig Harrington, the golfer, who I said he was overtraining because of his fear failure, there we can kind of see that we know that his approach to dealing with fear failure put him at a higher risk for burnout, because he said, I've got to practice hard to avoid failure. And so that can be quite dangerous. So I think many of you watching this, coaches, are probably sitting here and saying, well, hang on, at the end of the day, we're coaches. We need our athletes to perform. So what's the relationship between fear of failure and performance? Sadly, I don't know. That's the short answer is we don't know. There's only been 3 studies in sport that have actually looked at fear failure and performance. And one of them says there's no relationship between the two, and 2 say that it indirectly impacts fear failure in a negative manner. So what that means is that 2 studies have found that fear failure leads to increased levels of anxiety, and the increased levels of anxiety leads to poor performance within athletes, okay? So in that sense, fear failure by itself doesn't cause problems for performance, but it can be associated with a lot of these problems here that we see, and that can be problematic for their performance. So for those who think, well, actually fear failure might be a good thing, my response there is, it might be. In the short term, it could be like, look at Patrick Harrington again, like he's won 2 British Opens, objectively speaking, brilliant. But if he has burnout, if he develops burnout and drops out of sport, then the question is, okay, was that worth it? Okay, so that's kind of where I stand right now. Is fear failure can have short-term positive impacts on performance, but in the long term, I think it could come at risks. But this is based on what I know right now, and once more studies have been done examining this, we'll know more. So that is subject to change. All right, now onto the next part. What can you do as a coach to help an athlete with fear failure? Well, the first thing is, if an athlete has fear failure, I recommend, and I'm not just saying this because I'm one myself or because I've been studying fear failure, but I recommend that if an athlete is suffering from this or is dealing with this, that you get a mental performance consultant involved, such as myself or anyone else that you choose to do so, that you decide you want, and get them involved to help the athlete. So the athlete, because mental performance consultants are trained in this area, have studied these kinds of areas, can help athletes develop coping mechanisms to deal with it. But as I said early on, fear failure is developed through parental practices, through coach practices, through the social environment is what is bad for athletes' fear failure. So even if an athlete learns coping mechanisms, if you're a coach who is intentionally or unintentionally behaving in a manner that's constantly increasing athlete fear failure, then you might mitigate the benefit that they have from working with a consultant. So it's important that you as a coach also try and make changes to help with athlete fear failure. So what can you do, right? The short answer is you try and create an environment where failure is not punished, but accepted and used as a learning tool. Failure is inevitable. We know that. We see all these quotes, which is like failure is a stepping stone to success and stuff like that. Failure is inevitable. You can't grow without failing. We all know that. But depending on how a coach treats failure, it can either encourage athletes to acknowledge failure and accept it as a way to grow and improve, but it can also you can also treat failure in a manner that encourages athletes to try their best to avoid it at all costs, which we've seen in the last slide can be problematic over time. Okay. So what can you do? Let's go into some examples here of things that you can do as a coach to try and help athletes with fear failure, and to try and create an environment where failure is more accepted. First of all, if an athlete fails, like I said, failure is a very broad term. Your definition of failure might not be the same definition that the athlete has for failure. So let's use golf an example. Let's say the athlete comes in and shoots a terrible score, and you want to just like kind of shout at them and tell them off for not shooting a score, for instance. Or you just want to focus on the mistakes and say, well, this was terrible, this was terrible, this was all terrible. That's not necessarily the best way forward. We know from research that one way of helping athletes with fear failure is to just like focus on like the positives of that failure. Chances are there was something good about the athlete's performance. They didn't just suck, okay? If we use golf an example, maybe every part of their game was dreadful, but maybe their putting was actually really good. So focus on the positives a bit, like just encourage them a bit and let them know like you did some good today, and like this is okay, you're going to grow from this, yeah? Another thing you can do after failure is offer sincere advice for improvements rather than just providing generic statements. We've all heard situations where coaches might be like, or people will just be like, just keep doing what you're doing, just dig it out the dirt, or just stick at it, have at it, those kinds of things. These are very generic statements. And like, the athlete's smart enough to know that that's true. They need to keep practicing. So just saying keep at it isn't necessarily as helpful as you think it might be, okay? So what you can do is, if the drive, let's say we use golf again as an example, let's say their driving is poor, like give them specific feedback on, all right, do this and this and this is how you might be able to improve your driving stats, okay? So focus on specific areas and for improvements for the athletes. More generally speaking, try and build a relationship with a person. Try and focus on the person as a whole. There's more to this person that you're working with, that you're coaching, than just an athlete who brings home awards for you, okay? The athlete has a life outside of sport as well. If you develop a relationship with the athlete and show them that you care, and you care about them more than just their performances, and you care about life outside of sport, they will develop a bond with you where they will realize that failure is something that's acceptable, and that will show them that like you're supportive of them outside of sport as well, irrespective of how they perform. Yeah. I think the most important thing is stay consistent, and that's really difficult. So some of you are probably watching this and thinking, okay, this is maybe I can take some steps away here, and this is what I can do. And you'll try it, but then within a few weeks, you might start forgetting about it and might fall back into old habits. Behavior change is extremely, extremely challenging. It takes several years. It can take several years, and it's really hard. So make sure you stay consistent and really try and remind yourself of staying consistent with these behaviors, yeah? The other thing I want to add here, some of you might be seeing this and being like, well, it kind of sounds like you're asking us to be like soft and like not hard on the athletes. That's not what this is about at all. It's trying to show an athlete that you care about them. It's trying to show an athlete who has grown up in a home that's affectionately deprived that you care, that failure's acceptable and that failure's there and it's going to help them grow, okay? So it's not about being soft. You're just caring about the person. All right, we're nearing the end now, and I think this might even be the final slide, so bear with me and then we can get into questions. So what can you do as a coach, all right? So one thing you can do as a coach is, first of all, you can like obviously learn how to behave in a way in a coaching environment, so you can treat athletes in a manner more conducive to learning. But what you can do is actually you can work with a mental performance consultant as well. We don't just work with athletes; we can work with you as well, to help you learn ways to like change your coaching methods. Not teach you what to coach, but just the way, like in a psychosocial manner, just how you say things. That's like a way you can work with us. But what else we can do is, you as a coach have pressures that athletes don't understand, okay? Your job is to bring home trophies. If you don't bring home trophies, you might lose your job. You might lose funding. So you are under pressures that we can't possibly understand as athletes. So you can work with a mental performance consultant just to develop like coping strategies and coping mechanisms that make you, let's say, that help you with your own personal growth, okay? So it's easy for me to say, coaches do all this and do all that, but I want you to know that I understand that it's not easy being a coach and that you have a lot of pressures that we don't understand, yeah? So we can help as mental performance consultants for you coaches, and we can be there for you as well. Also, like I said, getting back to being soft as a coach, changing these behaviors that I mentioned in this last slide here isn't just about reducing fear of failure within athletes. It also there's also plenty of research that shows that these kind of coaching behaviors have a positive impact on motivation, enjoyment they get out of sport, and that essentially leads to better performance as well. So I'm not just telling you to do this stuff to like help them with fear of failure. It's a much, much bigger thing going on here other than fear of failure. It's enjoyment, motivation, and performance as well, okay? And to give you an example of what I mean with being a coach that like really adheres to these things that I suggested in the last slide, I'm sure some of you have seen the Netflix documentary, The Last Dance with with the Chicago Bulls. The coach, Phil Jackson at the time, I want to focus on one example because that's a brilliant documentary. And if you haven't seen it, I highly encourage you to watch it. But there's one scenario with Phil Jackson, the coach, and Dennis Rodman. There's a situation where they're at the playoffs, I think, and they need to win 1 or 2 more games, and then they win the playoff. And Dennis Rodman one night just goes out and says, "I'll see you later." And the coach is like, "Oh," the players are like, "All right, go away." And he goes and takes part in wrestling and it gets drunk and stuff like that. Instead of the coach, then when he finds out, like kicking him off the team and sacking him and stuff like that, the coach says, "Well, that's just kind of who he is. Like we have developed enough trust that I know he can go away and do his own stuff and then come back and be the person he needs to be on the court." He came back and performed outstandingly the next game. I think part of that is also because there's this trust between the coach and the player. So that's the example I wanted to use to showcase how changing your practices as a coach and focusing on certain areas more than others can be hugely beneficial to the athletes. All right, sorry. Now getting back to the last bits here. So how can you, let's say you don't want to work with a mental performance consultant and you just want to leave this session today saying, well, what can I do now, all right? So what you can do is you can reflect on your coaching strategies and evaluate themselves. And how I recommend you do that is just take a piece of paper and like write down like your values. What do you value as a person? What do you value as a coach? And then why did you get into coaching? And then look at your behaviors and look at your values and see, do these match up? Do these align with each other? If yes, great job. If no, think about, well, how can I change my behaviors in a manner that will maybe make me align more with my values? That's one way of doing it. The risk there, though, is that we have biases. So it's called a self-serving bias. So what that means is just basically we think a bit higher of ourselves than other people do. So if you're completing these reflections yourself, they're definitely beneficial. I'm not saying you shouldn't do it, but I'm just saying be aware that there's certain biases involved when you do it yourself. So in light of this, what else can you do? You can get someone to observe your training and evaluate you as a coach. Like, how are you as a coach behaving towards your athletes? Please, 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 I can't say this often enough, make sure that person you get to evaluate is a neutral person. The last thing you want is it to be like your assistant coach or an athlete. And because if they say something that you don't like, you do not want to be in a position where you start holding power over them and can punish them or something like that. That's not fair. That's not good on you, and it's not good for the person observing you. So make sure you bring someone in from the outside that can evaluate you in a neutral manner. And then finally, you can hand feedback forms out to former athletes. But again, make sure they're anonymous, please. And don't hand them out to current athletes, because even if they're anonymous, you might read the reports and not like it and then treat your current athletes in a certain way. And so that's why I recommend former athletes. Okay, that's the end of it for me. If you're interested in learning more, I recommend you can follow me on Twitter. That's my username on Twitter, my user handle. My Twitter stuff is a bit more academic, so I don't know if that's of interest to you. And you can follow me on Instagram. That's where I post a lot of like relevant stuff, like coaching stuff I've been posting out the last few weeks. So follow that if you want to learn some more about this stuff. And then you can also just message me if you're interested in chatting. My website is still under construction, so I don't have anything up there. But if you follow me on my social media accounts, I plan on having coaching resources at some point. So just like stay in touch with that if you want to learn more. If you're interested in working with mental performance consultants or learning more about them, here's the Canadian Sports Psychology Association website. I recommend you go on that website if you want to. They have a list of all the people you can work with, and don't just listen to me and say I sound nice or don't sound nice. Do your homework, look to see who else is out there. And lastly, if you're interested in having these slides, send me a message on my social media or email me or ask. We'll figure out a way. And I'm happy to give you the slides, but I've also created like an infograph, like a simple one-page infograph with like the summary of everything. If you're interested in having that, just let me know. And that is it for me. Thank you so much for attending, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Great, thank you, Simon. And yeah, I will be following up with an email, and I'll include all of this. So I see some questions already about that. Yeah, I'll include the slides and all of these ways to connect with Simon, so you guys can ask him questions. So Simon, I've received a couple of private questions, so I'll read them aloud. So how can you help an athlete with accepting a loss?
Well, I think the simple way there, again, it's a tough one to answer because it depends on how severe the athlete's, let's say, fear failure is. But how can you help an athlete accept a loss? Simply like let them know that it's okay, and like explain to them that failure is a stepping stone in order to succeed. It's really important. You don't grow up, you're not born brilliant. You're not born as Steph Curry or Tiger Woods or whoever you, or Rory McIlroy in golf or whatever it is. It takes time. It takes failure to get to that point. So just reassure them that it's okay they failed, but failure is a necessity in order to becoming great.
Great. And I think a follow-up to it was just kind of like, is being a good sport, or how can you be a good sport in both wins and losses?
Good question. How can you be a good sport after wins and losses? I mean, just be humble, I suppose. I mean, if you win, don't shove it down other people's throat. Like, celebrate, absolutely. Like, if you win a big event, by all means, be happy and celebrate and do whatever it is you do. But like, don't go to the opponent and like rub it in their face or something like that. The same as if you lose, like, just be humble about it. Like, don't go complaining and being like, oh, we were so unlucky, or the referee robbed us from this or something like that. Recognize that failure sucks, but it's part of it. Say, okay, what did I do wrong? What can I do better? And how can I improve from here on out?
Great, thank you. If anyone has any more questions, feel free to unmute yourself or type it in the chat box and I can read it aloud.
Hi there. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Sorry about my mic going on earlier. I was walking.
Okay.
His phone was in my pocket. I have two questions. One kind of on a follow-up, that's something that you mentioned. When you mentioned the steakhouse versus McDonald's example, what would be the kind of consequence or reward of only having the positive aspects? So say you're saying, oh, if you guys win this game, then we'll go out to the steakhouse, but there's no repercussion if you lose, but they keep failing towards that. So, or they achieve it. Does that have any impact on fear of failure?
Interesting. So it kind of, that's interesting, because I'm not quite sure I have a straightforward answer to that. So
that's okay.
It's better to not punish failure and only reward success. That is definitely better than punishing failure. But only rewarding success and reacting neutral to failure is also not perfect. So while it's better than punishing failure, simply ignoring failure isn't also the right way to go. You need to acknowledge that it happened, but just kind of do it in a way that's beneficial. But I can't off the top of my head think of a way right now, like in terms of like the restaurant, but I'm not sure if that's answered your question or not.
No, that definitely helps for sure. And that's kind of where my head was at with that as well. My second question is how do you approach fear of failure within coaches? Like I coach an individual sport. I coach artistic gymnastics, women. And often I find myself feeling so guilty and responsible for their failures because like, oh, what could I have done more as a coach? And so sometimes it gets me worked up as a coach leading up to bigger competition. So how do you address fear of failure within coaches?
So that's really interesting. So fear of failure in coaches has not been studied at all. Well, I've done one study so far where I've kind of like introduced the idea of fear of failure in coaches, but it's not been looked at all yet. I think it's a huge thing just because of the pressures and everything you're under, and it deserves attention in itself. But how would you as a coach approach it? It's definitely tough. So I would say you just need to recognize yourself that failure is a learning curve and that you don't have control over your athletes at the time of their performing. Like, you might be able to give them a few tips now and then, but when the athlete's performing, that's the athlete performing, that's not you performing. So if they fail, don't take it personally, okay? Again, like, try and use it as a learning curve, like what can you do to improve? But you need to recognize that there's only so much control you have over your athletes. So attaching the athlete's performance to your whole self, attaching your self-worth to the athlete's performance is a slippery slope as well, and you should try and like get away from that if possible. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that definitely helps. Thank you.
No problem.
Great. Thank you, Jared and Simon. We have another question in the chat box, and then I have a question too. So do you find there is a difference in fear of failure between girls and boys? Is one gender more receptive than the other? Very good question. So it's the issue we have is that there's not really enough research that's been done to really understand gender differences yet within fear failure. There's a few studies that have, and I will just go back here to show you.
There is one, and there's typically say that like females in like 3 or 4 studies, there's been evidence of females having higher levels of fear of devaluing one's self-estimate than males. And that means that females are worried, have more fear of having to say, well, I'm not as good as I thought I was following failure than males. That's all that I've seen as of right now. Other than that, I've not seen any gender differences, and it's too inconclusive to make any real recommendations off the back of that. We just need to do more research. But what I can say is that it exists in both genders, and it needs to be studied more to understand how it's impacted in different age groups and different genders specifically. I hope that answers the question.
Great. Yeah, I'll let you know if they follow up with anything else.
I think, hi Simon,
Hi.
How are you?
Very good, thank you.
I think just want to, I just want to add what you say, like about the estimate about the females and boys.
Yeah.
It's actually true. I think it's, I believe it's a mindset of like the girls. When they're about to fail, they think about a lot of stuff at the same time, like a lot of thoughts going on in their mind.
Yeah.
So they're more focused on like, oh, I failed, so I failed my parents, my coach, I won't get my food, and they get like deep, sad afterward. But boys, like we do a lot of exercise trainings, we burn out basically. Sometimes we don't realize how much like it really is gonna cost us, right?
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. So I am by the furthest thing away from a gender expert, but what we do hear that there's different societal expectations of males and females growing up that are placed on boys and girls. So it's not I can kind of see, based on like societal expectations, that females might have these experiences higher than males, but it's too inconclusive to make any general recommendations off the back of that. But yes, thank you for that.
Great, thank you. And I have a question that kind of stems from what Jared was asking. So I coach girls and I coach ringette, and during the season we were struggling on hitting the net, like our shooting accuracy.
Yep.
So we just simplified a drill where you skated past the ring, pick it up, shoot on the net.
Yep.
But the girls, I didn't want to do this, but the girls wanted there to be a consequence if you missed the net. So whether that be like push-ups or laps, what are your thoughts behind that? Like if the athletes want there to be a punishment, kind of like an incentive to do well.
Yeah, I think that can work. I think the point there is that occasionally you can introduce, like, because that creates pressure situations, and sport is all about pressure. Like what can we do in training to create the right environment that mimics kind of like pressure situations? So having consequences or punishments isn't the worst thing. It depends. Like, sadly, the answer is it depends. It depends on how you structure it. If you every time say, if you miss the net, that's it, you're off. You're going to run laps or something like that, or I'm going to make you do 1,000,000 push-ups. That's not great. Punish them just for the sake of it. You need, if you want to have, if it needs to come from the athletes, athletes need to be on board with this, I think, because it's easier for a coach to sit back and say, yeah, not good enough, go run a lap, or punish you. But if the athletes are on board, then it's different, because then the athletes understand that it's not, you're not attacking their self-worth for them not performing to their level. It's simply the athlete saying, okay, like, I want to put pressure on myself, and this is why I want to be punished, but not because I am unworthy, or whatever you want to, however you want to refer to it. Does that help?
Yeah, it makes sense. Yeah, totally. And someone just asked too about like the age difference. So I'll be clear that was like a U19 provincial team. Like it's older athletes who want that pressure all the time.
Yeah.
And I will say too, as a coach who played my sport, sometimes I jump in too to kind of show that like I can, I don't know, it's good to show that as a coach you want to be in those pressure situations too. So someone just asked, do you adjust your approach for fear of failure by age difference? For example, elite university player and an under 13 or under 14 player?
That's a very good question. Thank you. The issue here again is that we simply don't know different age differences, how fear failure is experiences within, let's say, 8-year-olds and then within university athletes. All we know is that fear failure is experienced in as young as people as 8 years old but has also been found in people as old as 40 years old. That's kind of the age range where we're currently at. We need to do a lot more research to know whether younger ones are more susceptible to it than older ones, how it impacts younger ones differently to older ones. There's a lot to learn. And I guess when you work with young kids, you need to change the whole coaching approach anyway, because like with let's say you've got elite athletes, you can then say to them, focus on more like intense technical drills, because they have an understanding of the technique of the game. But like beginners or like younger kids, it's all about having fun. So like the whole environment's kind of a different approach there in my take. But I'm not an expert in coaching environment, so coaching capacity. So you might disagree with me on that.
Okay, great. Okay, a couple more questions are coming in.
Yeah.
So looking at failure post-game is one thing. Is there a different approach for in-game failure correction? Also top end player to role player?
So if we, we use basketball because the coach has minimal impact then during the actual plays. If a coach like treats failure during the game differently than after the game, I think yes, there is. Again, it needs to be, the athletes need to understand that the way you as a coach are behaving during the games, it's just, you can't take your time to explain and, okay, I'm treating you this way because this is the way I think this, and so on and so forth. You need to be quick. It's just shouting from the sideline, so you don't have time to really get into specifics and complexities there. So I think what can be done there is just to have a discussion with an athlete as to like, what do you think you need to be reminded of when you're not performing, when you're failing during an event. So if let's say your technique's poor, let's say you're releasing the ball too soon when you're shooting in basketball, then the coach says, okay, I'm just going to yell in and say release, just focus on your release. And that can be, it might sound harsh, but because it's loud, I have to yell. So just make it clear to the athlete like what it is. The athlete and the coach need to have that conversation about how that works and how that can benefit from the athlete. Because just yelling from the sideline doesn't do any good.
Okay, great. And just a couple more questions. So how do you suggest dealing with one player on a team that has this issue which has a negative effect on or distracts the other team members?
That's a really interesting question. I think I would need to know more about the case, as into, well, what kind of impact does it have on the athlete that it's affecting the other team players? I can't give a black and white answer here. And my general recommendation there would be bringing a mental performance consultant that can work with the athlete and try and understand what's going on to try and help that athlete. I don't think the athlete should be shunned or kicked off the team or anything like that. I also don't think that the coach should then change the whole strategy to suit one athlete and then at the risk of negatively impacting 10 or 15 others. And so I just think a conversation needs to be had there between the mental performance consultant and athlete, and then between, if confidentiality allows for it, and between like the coach, the athlete, and the mental performance consultant, to just kind of all get on the same page what's going on and what can be done to deal with this situation.
They just added, I might not have been clear, a negative effect on personal and sport relationships along with overall performance. So like that one teammate has a negative effect on the whole team.
Yeah, okay, so if that one teammate has a negative effect on the whole team, again, bringing the mental performance consultant or the coach can start the discussion with the athlete and say, just like, look, what's going on? Like, there's clearly something happening here. I can see it, you can see it, the whole team can see it. Do you want to talk to me about it? And if they say yes, then great, then talk to them about it. Excuse me, but if they say no, then like just bring in someone else to like talk to the athlete to try and understand what's going on. It's too simple for me to say do this or this because of that. We don't know. So I wish I could be more specific, but I hope that kind of gets to the bottom of your question.
Great. Yeah, I'll let you know if they follow up at all. Oh, yeah. What if they cannot see it regardless of who tells them?
So as in the athlete can't see it or the coach can't see it or what?
So yeah, I think the athlete.
So if you as a coach talk to the athlete and it just doesn't, or I speak to him as a mental performance consultant and it doesn't change anything, then I guess then again a discussion needs to be had as to, well, do you want to be in this team? Do you want to remain in this team? Do you want to perform still? Do you enjoy being in this team? Or would you maybe be better off elsewhere? Or maybe you want to try a different sport? I don't know. And these are all very, for what it's worth, like beige answers, and I'm sorry, or gray answers. I'm sorry, I can't be more specific, but context, I would need to be in the situation to have a better understanding of that. I'm sorry.
No, it makes sense. And sometimes it does come down to like whether or not the athlete is motivated and wants to be there, like you said. So I think that's a good answer. And then someone just commented, maybe we should stop using the word failure and replace it with learning opportunity.
I mean, that's great. It's that might be something to talk about with like younger athletes or something who are susceptible to having a negative connotation associated with failure. Because it is hurtful if you've gone out and played, let's say golf, it's 5 hours long, you come in and you've tried your best and your coach says, well, that sucked and you failed today. That's really hurtful. Okay. So there's no denying that depending on how someone talks about failure, it can be really a really painful experience. So there might be an idea to talk about, all right, let's try not to focus on the word failure so much, but let's just focus on, okay, this is what went well and this is what didn't go well and this is how we can improve for the future. Instead of saying, well, you sucked and like work harder, because great. I mean, the athlete already knows that.
Great. Okay. Thank you so much, Simon. And if anyone has any last minute questions, feel free to put them in the chat box or open your mic. But we will start to wrap up as we're nearing the hour. So thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. We're always happy to have new presenters on here, and I know everyone's always eager to learn about mental performance. And so this was great, Simon. We really appreciate all you had to offer and all the responses to the questions. Sorry, I'm just looking through the chat box to see if there was anything else that was said. I
suppose just while you're looking, just one final thing. Yeah, by all means, like if you've got any questions, just ask Kirsty for like my email address, or like follow me on like some of these handles, and then you can just message me directly if you want to have like the infograph that summarizes today's session, or if you want to have these slides, I'm happy to share. But as I've been told, this will be on YouTube as well. But if you want access to the slides or anything too, let me know and I'm happy to share with you.
Mm-hmm. And there was just one comment, which I think is a great practice as a coach. So after each match, they ask the athletes what they did well and then what they need to work on. So kind of giving the athletes the floor.
That's a great way to kind of end this discussion, because absolutely we all know that like giving athletes a sense of autonomy is hugely important for their motivation and like many other things. So asking the athlete like, okay, what did you think didn't go well today, and what do you think you could do better? Because it's really easy as a coach to just say and say this wasn't good, this wasn't good, and this wasn't good, but the athlete might have a completely different perception of that. So let the athlete try and figure that out on their own. That doesn't mean you don't do anything, but just like take a step back and let the athlete try and start that debate. And then if they have questions, step in and say, this is my thoughts. But if they're happy and you're happy, then just let it be their decision.
Yeah, totally agree. Yeah, thank you for that comment. And thank you, Simon. And again, thank you everyone for joining us from all over the country. It's so great to see so many coaches here every week. And a reminder, we will be posting this on YouTube so you can go back and rewatch all of our other sessions. In terms of next session, our next session is tomorrow evening at 8 p.m. with a different mental performance consultant. So Bryce Tully will be coming on to talk about mindfulness, which has been another topic that a lot of coaches have requested. So we're excited to have more mental performance knowledge being shared with our coaches. So just a reminder too, if you have any suggestions for topic, feel free to reach out to me with any recommendations, and we hope to see you tomorrow night. So thank you.
Simon, when are you graduating?
About a year from now.
Oh yeah, one more year.
Yeah, sadly, yeah. And I'm nearly there now.